Welcome to the Algebra 2 review for mid-Unit 7 test. The test will be Monday on the Kiddom website. This is the next to last test you'll take this year, so be sure to take it seriously and try your best, because remember that your test average counts for half your grade. So number 1, you're going to be told to select all the methods that can be used to randomly assign people in the experimental study they talk about into two groups. What you need to understand is that to randomly assign people to groups in an experimental study, you must make sure there can be no bias. You don't want any patterns. You don't want any human interference. You want to make sure that whatever you choose is going to be a completely fair, everyone has the same chance of ending up in either group. No human interference, no patterns, anything like that. Number 2, if the distribution of weights for something is approximately normally distributed, which of the following is the best estimate of the probability that a randomly selected item has a weight less than some given x? What you need to make sure you remember is that on a normal distribution curve, approximately 68% of results are within one standard deviation above and below the mean. Then 95% of results are within two standard deviations above and below the mean. And finally, 99.7% of results are within three standard deviations above and below the mean. The remaining percentage needs to be divided in half to distribute above and below. For example, if 68% is between one standard deviation above and below the mean, then that leaves 32%, and 16% is below the area, and 16% is above the area. So as you're answering these questions, think about how much is inside the area you're talking about, and then how much does that leave outside of the area. And if you have equal amounts below and above the area, you need to remember to split that remaining percentage between the two. Number 3, select all the properties that must be true of a normal distribution. Some things to keep in mind while you read through your choices. The shape of a normal distribution is approximately symmetrical and bell-shaped. The measure of center for a normal distribution is the mean. The mean is your average, and it is located at the peak of the bell. The measure of variability for a normal distribution is the standard deviation. This is measuring the variability, which means it's measuring how widely spread out the data points are. And finally, the area under a normal curve is equal to 1. So if you add all of the proportions together, they should equal 1. And you can use that if you know some proportions but not another. You can subtract what you do know from 1 to find out what's remaining for the rest. Why is this advertisement misleading? We need to remember that good statistics are based on random sampling. And accounts for any bias or patterns that could affect the results. We want to make sure it's completely free of any type of interference. Number 5. For this situation, which would be the best way to collect data? An experiment, a survey, or another type of observational study? We need to remember that a survey is just questions. That you are relying on people to answer truthfully, while an observational study involves analyzing data, you have no influence over. Number 6. Describe a good method that the manager could use to select the 50 people. When you're trying to answer this one, remember a good method of selection involves randomness and every person having the same chance, no bias, and no patterns. So you want to make sure that you're taking that into account when you're deciding which method would be the best. Number 7. Explain why an experimental study would be better than a survey or observational study in this situation. Remember that an experimental study allows you to influence the variables while the others do not. Number 8. Why is it reasonable to model this distribution with a normal distribution? When trying to answer this one, remember a normal distribution requires the data to be approximately symmetrical and bell-shaped. It must meet these two criteria in order to use normal distribution and the tools that go along with it. Number 9. Use a normal distribution to estimate the probability of a situation. You can use an online normal distribution calculator. Simply Google the term and some will show up. And the way these work is that you need to input the mean, the standard deviation, and what area you want to calculate for. So you can tell it you want the bottom 50% or the middle 50% or the top 25%, something like that. And our last point here, number 10, write a sentence or two that summarizes any conclusions that can be made about the statistical question. So when you're getting to this point, the answer that you write should compare the mean and the standard deviation of the two groups. So when you are explaining the conclusions that you're making, make sure you talk about those two things. How do their means relate to each other? What does that tell you? And how do their standard deviations relate to each other? And what does that tell you? If you have any questions about any of the concepts on this study guide, please use class time to ask for further clarification before we have the test on Monday.